Hello and welcome back to Japan Memo, the IISS Japan Chair Programme podcast. I'm Robert Ward, Japan Chair and Director of Geoeconomics and Strategy here at the IISS. Here we're joined by experts, strategists and practitioners to analyse why Japan matters in today's regional and global geopolitical landscape. Today we're very excited to welcome three fantastic guests, Professor Richard Samuels, Professor Kotani Ken, and Hosaka Sanshiro, to discuss Japanese intelligence. First, some introductions. Richard Samuels, Dick Samuels, is the Ford International Professor of Political Science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he was Director of the Center for International Studies from 2001 to 2024. Dick has been writing about Japan throughout his career and has produced some excellent books, including 311, Disaster and Change in Japan, and Machiavelli's Children, Leaders and Their Legacies in Italy and Japan. His book, which I have read and can highly recommend, Special Duty, A History of the Japanese Intelligence Community, was named one of the best books of 2019 by the Council on Foreign Relations journal Foreign Affairs. Welcome, Dick.
It's a pleasure.
Kotani Ken is a professor at Nihon University in Japan. He's currently a visiting research fellow at the Department of International History at the London School of Economics. During his affiliation as a research fellow of the LSE, Ken is planning to research the Second London Naval Conference in 1935 to 36. Ken's major fields of studies are Anglo-Japanese relations in the 1930s, the Pacific War and intelligence history. His latest book, Nihon Intelligence, which translates as History of Japanese Intelligence After World War II, which was published in 2022. Ken has also written a volume in English about Japanese intelligence in World War II, which was published in 2009. He translated Dick's book, Special Duty, into Japanese. So welcome, Ken.
Nice to see you.
Hosaka Sanshiro is a PhD student at the University of Tartu in Estonia. Sanshiro joined the Estonian think tank, the International Centre for Defence and Security, in July 2021 in a part-time role. His research interests include strategic narratives of non-democracies targeting academia, political technology, Soviet-Russian reflexive control and active measures, and intelligence history. His book, Choho Kokka Russia, translated into English as Intelligence State Russia from the Soviet KGB to Putin's FSB regime, won the 32nd Yamamoto Shichihei Humanities and Social Science Publication Award. Welcome, Sanshiro.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here to analyse Japan's intelligence. Let's start with the specific features, peculiarities perhaps, of Japan's intelligence. To begin this discussion, I think we need to clarify the definition of intelligence. In Ken's book, Japan's Intelligence History, Ken introduces a definition that describes intelligence as a function that contributes to the formulation of policy decisions that are in the best interest of the country's national security. Therefore, the strategic use of national intelligence covers national security, diplomacy, economics, and domestic public security. Start with you, Dick, if I may. In your great book, Special Duty, which is one of the first books on Japan's strategic intelligence, given your research in this book and what you know more broadly about the subject, how does the Japanese government view its intelligence capabilities overall?
Thanks very much. Pleasure to be here and honored to be kicking this off, but particularly delighted to be on a panel with Professor Kotani, an old friend, and with Dr. Hosaka, since they know the answer to this question very well, which is that it depends on when you're asking it. In the sense that the government's view of its intelligence has quite considerably since its heyday during the Asia-Pacific War. And it must be said that even when Japanese intelligence was most active and most robust, warfighters reportedly treated intelligence officers with disdain, and intelligence officers rarely shared what they knew with their counterparts in other intelligence silos. This is a reflection of how the government viewed intelligence. After the war, there was a brief flirtation with the need to establish a full spectrum intelligence system, including this flirtation, including with General Charles Willoughby, who was the G2 for the US occupation in Japan. But Willoughby and the new CIA, when it was finally stood up, lacked a common vision for what the Japanese intelligence community should look like. The Japanese didn't have a clear sense of it yet either. And so after that, there were at best incremental changes. The view of the government was that some wanted to create a full spectrum post-war intelligence system, but it was a matter of real dispute. So as a general characterization, after the aggressive expansion during Japan's imperial moment, The Cold War's intelligence community basically deteriorated into a bureaucratic scrum, was characterized by competitive and mutually incompatible intelligence units. And further, it had to operate for a very long time, maybe still does, under the often very annoying direction of the United States. It's certainly well after the occupation had ended. And so it had to do all this without much public support. Japanese public did not embrace the idea of intelligence because it involved surveillance. And some might say that the Japanese government therefore treated intelligence very gingerly. And others would go further and say that it was taboo for too long. The good news for advocates of a more robust intelligence community, I think, is that after Japan stood up its new National Security Council in 2013, for the past decade, the bureaucratic competition seems to have been much better contained. And the public, though wary as it is of government surveillance at home, there's living memory of what it was like in the 30s and 40s, but now accepts the legitimacy of an intelligence capability, even in the cyber domain, and the legitimacy of it to contribute to national security. So that's just a quick overview of all the changes that we've seen in the way the government views intelligence.
Ken, for those that don't know the specific features of today's Japanese intelligence community, could you tell us how it's structured overall, please?
The size of Japanese intelligence community is very small, but complicated. At present, the Cabinet Intelligence Research Office, silo, of the Cabinet Secretariat, is the central intelligence machinery of the community, such as American CIA, but the number of staff is very small, only 500. There are also 5 ministry-embedded apparatuses. The Public Security Department of the National Police Agency, NPA, is close to American FBI, which engages in counterespionage and terrorism in Japan. Defense Intelligence Headquarters of the Ministry of Defense, MOD, specialize in technical intelligence such as signals and geospatial intelligence. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, MOFA, has 2 intelligence services, the Intelligence and Analysis Service, IISS, and the Counterterrorism Unit, CTUJ. Both services are specialized in intelligence analysis and overseas and terrorism affairs. Lastly, the Public Security Intelligence Agency, PSIA, of the Ministry of Justice is a sort of security service, such as British MI5. These 6 agencies form a Japanese intelligence community.
Dick mentioned, I think, before the war that there wasn't much sharing of information or intelligence. Ken, you've just outlined the 6 agencies that Japan has now. What's the state of sharing, in your view, between these 6 units?
As Dick explained us, now we have the National Security Council and National Security Secretariat in the Cabinet Secretariat. These 6 agencies can share intelligence or information in the NSS or NSC for the moment.
Is that going well? I ask you because bureaucracies are famously siloed, stovepiped. Just trying to tease this out a bit.
It's getting better than before.
Okay. Sanshiro, Sasha, how does Japan's intelligence community, the distinguishing features of this, how does it compare with countries that you know well, like, for example, Russia at the moment?
I've been studying Russian intelligence. I'm not quite sure that I'm on the same page when we discuss intelligence, because the missions or philosophy of intelligence and counterintelligence agencies in Russia, right, or China are totally different from their democracy. I wrote a book about the history of Soviet Russian intelligence, from how it was established by Lenin and Dzerzhinsky for the survival of this communist revolutionary regime, and how many of these Soviet intelligence components, autocratic Soviet totalitarian intelligence components, survived in terms of saving its philosophy Czechism, and KGB personnel, and methods such as active measures. Professor Kotani-san reviewed my book and pointed out that the Western intelligence agencies collect and assess intelligence information independently, at least they try to independently of politics and try to contribute to the leader's judgment. But when it comes to Russian regime or the party central regime, the intelligence is not for optimal decision making of the leaders. I read Professor Kotani's book, History of Japanese Intelligence, which described how this historical process, how Japan's post-war intelligence community developed under various constraints such as bureaucratic and legal barriers and cooperation with the United States during the Cold War or oversight by parliament and civil society out of fear that military and intelligence things may get out of control again and be oppressive and return censorship. If compare the how Japanese post-war intelligence community developed and a country like Russia, how this post-totalitarian intelligence and counterintelligence agency persist, you will understand that intelligence agencies developed under state governed by the rule of law and the democratic control. The difference between this development with these intelligences in different political settings.
Dick, I saw you nodding when Sanshiro was talking about the difference between Russian intelligence, the mission, and Japan, and the difference between Russia and democracies. Do you want to add anything to what Sanshiro says on that?
No, I was nodding because I was learning.
Okay.
So it may have distracted, but I found that fascinating. And I just assumed, as many of us in the West do, that the way Russia does intelligence has a lot more of domestic oversight, domestic surveillance. Authoritarian states generally will run their systems differently. But then again, we've learned about all sorts of intrusions by democratic states into the private conversations of its citizens. The one thing that's interesting is in the Japanese case is where oversight resides in the current system. And there's a committee that's set up inside the Diet and it's responsible to the cabinet office, so forth. The real oversight has been the public, which is not a formal oversight unit. It's not the legislature, it's not bureaucrats, it's not a specialized committee. But the freedom that citizens have in democratic societies has repeatedly given them the power to subvert some of the more heavy-handed approaches that states of all stripes tend to lean toward in their intelligence units.
For Japan, intelligence has been critical to its national security, partly, of course, because of the constant geopolitical threats from neighboring countries like North Korea, China, and Russia. But Japan's intelligence community has been criticized for being underdeveloped due to low investment and thin human resources. Question for Ken. Why has the intelligence community in Japan not developed as it has in other countries since the Second World War?
Before the Second World War, the Japanese Army and Navy's intelligence sections were responsible for military and overseas intelligence. Bureau of Police and Public Security, Ministry of Foreign Affairs was responsible for counter-espionage in Japan. But these apparatuses were dismissed in the post-war period. In early part of the 1950s, Japan tried to set up a new body of intelligence starting from scratch under the auspices of the Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida and the Chief Cabinet Secretary Taketora Ogata. Ogata was strongly supported by the US CIA, and they intended to establish a central intelligence machinery similar to the CIA. They also understood that the lack of central intelligence machinery in the Japanese government during the war caused a serious sectionalism in fighting among the Army and Navy. However, as Dick told us, the pacifism place in the post-war period opposed to the plan of establishing the new intelligence agency. As a result, Prime Minister Yoshida was obliged to compromise with the press, establishing the Cabinet Intelligence Research Office in April 1952. The office was neither given enough staff, just 30, and nor an adequate legal basis that resulted in being malfunctioned as an intelligence apparatus throughout the Cold War period. In general, the Japanese government during the Cold War tended to depend on intelligence supplied by the US, and Japan didn't need to collect overseas intelligence by herself.
Dick, a question for you, just to follow on from what Ken's just said, thinking about the lack of a specialized foreign intelligence agency in Japan. And the closest that Japan has to that is probably the Counterterrorism Unit Japan, CTUJ, which was created only in 2015 to tackle the growing threat of overseas terrorist attacks involving Japanese citizens. How has the CTUJ been functioning, do you think? How effective has it been?
This is really interesting. I mean, invoking the CTU, which is designed to protect Japanese overseas, is really an intriguing way at a larger question, if I can hijack your question slightly, which is that I assume that, by asking Japan's not having a specialized intelligence unit, and in reference to Ken's response earlier, what we're really interested in is why it doesn't have a comprehensive one that's the equivalent of MI6 or CIA. This has long been an important question. And as Ken said, it came up in the 50s and was knocked away by public opinion. It still comes up in discussions about what's missing in Japanese intelligence. There was an old joke that the Japanese like to say that they didn't have a CIA, but they had a KGB. The KGB that they had was siloed the Keisatsu, the police, the Gaimusho, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Boei Cho at the time, the defense agency. So they understood the problem. It was not comprehensive, but siloed. Let's get back to CTU because I think it's a great prototype actually for something grander. Counterterrorism is, of course, it's a specialized element and it's just one of several that are truly comprehensive. The intelligence community would require it if it's going to have a strategic intelligence capacity to effectively inform policymakers. Of course, it's important to protect citizens abroad. The CTU was stood up to collect information specifically on that part of the world that's not the Americas. So its focus is on Southeast Asia, on South Asia, on the Middle East, on Africa, and on Europe. Its officers, mostly regional experts who are working in Japanese embassies and consulates abroad, they're primed to communicate with Japan's larger foreign security and intelligence agencies during terrorist crises. This is where I want to take it toward the notion of a prototype for something more comprehensive, because they're not limited to that function. Their remit also includes sharing and analysis on international terrorism and other issues. This is a direct quote from what it tells us in its mission statement. And other issues which may pose threats to national security. It's not just terrorism. So at least conceptually, broadening its remit to include other issues, other threats, renders, I think, the CTU potentially more than merely a specialized unit. Not knowing what the other issues and other threats the CTU people are now analyzing and whether they're doing it covertly with local assistance abroad, I think it would be premature and I think irresponsible of me to declare it a major step toward a comprehensive IC intelligence community with human intelligence that many policymakers and think tankers have been hoping for. But it's a tantalizing possibility since it has its advocates in government, in the LDP, and in think tanks.
Ken, I can see you nodding there. Dick has sort of tantalizingly said that the CTU could potentially be the sort of stepping stone to something else. Do you have any views on that yourself?
First of all, when we use the word of CTU, we have to be very careful because CTU is from the American TV drama
Yes.
24. The unofficial noticed that the name of CTU is the same as American TV drama, and he added the word Japan. So we officially call the organization as CTUJ, CTU Japan. That's the official name, so be careful. So CTUJ is almost a kind of overseas intelligence service, but CTUJ's mission is limited to just terrorism. So now the Japanese government is planning to expand its mission to, for example, economic security area or overseas information or something, etc., etc.
Ken, if I can just stick with you for a second. Japanese government's focusing a lot on economic security at the moment. And recently, the Japanese Diets enacted legislation to establish a security clearance system to allow critical government information to be classified for economic security reasons. How can Japan's intelligence community cooperate with the private sector and the academic community to boost the security of information overall?
Japanese government introduced the Act on the Protection of Specially Designated Secrets in 2013, which aims to prevent government officials from leaking secret information. But this law has not applied to the private sector. The government has passed a Bill of Security Clearance Act in this May, and it is expected to activate within this year. As far as academic community is concerned, there is no safeguard against information leakage for the moment.
So a lot of work still to be done. Dick?
If I may, this May legislation is really quite important, and I'm glad Ken raised it, because it extends beyond just defense and foreign affairs or cabinet officials. That is, clearances that it would allow and create are required now for personnel who have to go through background checks who work in economic-related ministries. It applies now to background checks to private citizens who are working in the defense industry who need access to classified information. It's a broader and innovative for Japan, new initiative to try to expand the range, because Ken's right, and we may talk about this later, I suppose, but there is very limited classification controls. There had been until the Special State Secrets Law. He's absolutely right. This one is getting folded into the Special State Secrets Law for its administration. So it's an expansion and an interesting one to watch.
Let's move to external intelligence threats now. And looking at recent trends in national intelligence, Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 has increased the importance of intelligence capability in conflict. Since the start of the war, the US and UK intelligence agencies have been involved in intelligence sharing with Ukrainian intelligence agencies to counter Russia's strategic disinformation warfare. The US has signed a new bilateral treaty pact with Ukraine, in part to promote intelligence sharing. Dick, how has the war in Ukraine shifted US intelligence sharing strategies?
Well, it's a great question. And I may not be the right person to ask because I'm not a specialist on US intelligence practice, but it seems to me two things strike me as possible ways in which the Ukraine war nudged US intel sharing practices in two ways. The first received a lot of attention and a lot of praise in the global media, and that was when President Biden publicly revealed detailed US intelligence on Russian capabilities and communications in the weeks and the days just ahead of the Russian assault on Ukraine. We all know that rule one for spy agencies is they do not share their assessments openly. And yet there was the United States sharing its assessments openly. So Biden's decision was a sharp departure from what long had been standard operating procedure. Revealing Russia's plans seemed to effectively delay the beginning of the war, and it gave Ukraine supporters, it seems, more time to deliver equipment, to formulate military plans, to design sanctions for what might lie ahead. As I say, I'm not a specialist on US practice, but Amy Ziegard at Stanford is. And she wrote a terrific piece for Foreign Affairs magazine in which she described this particular move on the part of the United States in Ukraine, a watershed moment for the world of intelligence. And I don't think that we're likely to find that incorrect going forward. I think it was a very important moment and it's worth paying attention to. The second thing, the second effect the Ukraine war may have had on US intelligence seems to be that it stimulated intel cooperation between the United States with its allies and among its allies as well. I mean, it's not as if the Five Eyes arrangement, which I hope we'll talk about later, but it's not as if Five Eyes suddenly ballooned to 25 eyes, but Washington certainly appeared to raise the pressure on allies to share intelligence, and it seems to be dangling Five Eyes cooperation as a sort of incentive. And I think we can draw a direct line from the Ukraine experience to Japan's even tighter embrace of intelligence reform and to the Camp David protocols, where Seoul and Tokyo pledged to elevate their intelligence cooperation and are practicing it, it seems. Now, it may be undiplomatic of me to say so, but it certainly seems clear to me that both developments were overseen by Washington, and Americans were, at least in the Japanese case, pushing on an open door.
Sanshiro, you're sitting in Estonia, which borders Russia. You got a lot of experience in looking at Russian intelligence in particular. Can you tell us what the latest trends in your view are in terms of the growing intelligence threats from countries such as Russia and perhaps China as well?
There are a lot of things going on, countries that are bordering with Russia. One historian, Timothy Schneider, took part in a conference last month in Tallinn, Latin American Security Conference, which are annually held in capital Estonia. He said, we are now in the situation of 1938, and Ukraine is now resisting. If we fail to help Ukraine, we will return to the situation of 1939, which allowed the USSR and Germany invade their neighbors. Now Russia became, especially after the first invasion started 2 years ago, Russia became bolder. There have been reports of Russian sabotage and subversion across Europe, including warehouse arson in the UK, plots to attack US military base in Germany, and jamming of GPS signals for flights over the Baltic Sea railroad sabotage in Sweden and Poland, attempt sabotage, and the attacks on important figures in Estonia. The list just goes on. And just in recent months, Kaya Giles, British experts, pointed out that this is not an isolated incident, but a sign that Russia has begun a systematic war against the whole of Europe. If an appropriate response is not taken from European side, Russia will interpret it as acceptable and will escalate the measures further. And the important thing, this sabotage and subversion, these operations tend to be carried out by local tax or paid people who just paid for their services. So they are not, Russia's agents in a true sense of the word, but more like disposable or expendable human resources. This is one. The Russia became more bolder. They used, this local tax, but at the same time, their methods still sophisticated. We've seen professional agents penetrating into many European countries. Just one really close example, familiar, I think, a few days ago, one of my former colleagues at the University of Tartu, who was arrested in January on the suspicion of the espionage for Russia 2 days ago, he was found guilty and sentenced to 6 years and 3 months in prison. He was professor of international relations at our university for more than 10 years. But the small surprise was that his handler was not the Russia's foreign intelligence agency or Federal Security Service, but his handler was Russia's military intelligence, GRU. The big surprise was that the prosecutor and court verified this, confirmed this information. He was trained as an agent when he was a student at St. Petersburg University in the 1990s, but his relationship with GRU handler was temporarily frozen and only revived when he moved to Estonia in 2010 as a lecturer at our university. So according to the Estonian authorities, head of the Estonian Internal Security Service, this former professor underwent extensive training, drills, and mentoring orientation to ensure high level of operational and security measures. He was a GR agent, not officer, but my colleagues at our institute, nobody, of course, suspected. On surface, he was against Russia's invasion. At the same time, he was collected political military intelligence of Estonia, and also Estonia has a large portion of Russian-speaking population. Nearly 30% of Estonian citizens speak Russian, but he collected this social cohesion, social situation of Estonia. When he went to Russia, he reported it to his GRU handler. What is important here is actually not only Russian, but also Chinese intelligence agencies. They aim to infiltrate in small countries that are likely to have weaker defense in the hope of obtaining intelligence shared by the EU and NATO member allies. But in case of it is that said that China and Russia are targeting Estonia. Estonia is a very small country. Population is just 1.3 million, so they're 100 times smaller than Japan. And even in the European scale, Estonia is a small country. But they are targeting Estonia because of its access to NATO information. But fortunately, our Estonia's counterintelligence agency has a good reputation, and they are skilled at detecting those malicious penetrations that was shown in this week.
You mentioned China just now, and in your recent article for IISS, A Forbidden Zone of No Limits Friendship, Possibilities and Constraints in Sino-Russia Intelligence Cooperation, you talk about the prospects for Chinese and Russian intelligence sharing. What do you think these prospects are? Do you think that China and Russia can work together on intelligence?
I think when it comes to China-Russia relations, strategic partnership, we've been seeing the growing cooperation between these two countries in the military, politically, and the economic spheres. And they share the adversary, Basically, they have the common adversary, United States. But when it comes to intelligence, I think their cooperation has some restraints. First, as I wrote in my report to my think tank, International Center for Defense and Security, history shows that the inner substance of the relationship between these two Eurasian autocracies is often kept deliberately hidden behind this beautifully decorated facade. The 1950 Sino-Soviet alliance, which seemed so firm as a monolith, it disappeared, and it actually worrying policymakers in Washington who had hoped for decoupling China from Soviet Union. But this China-Soviet alliance, from the beginning, internalized geopolitical discord and deep chasm between the two countries. Stalin demanded China take into account Soviet interests in Manchuria and Xinjiang. So following Stalin's death, and Beijing and Moscow split ideologically, culminating in this border clash in 1969. This is, I think, the only direct military engagement between two nuclear armed states during the Cold War. So the second, in the 1930s, 40s, Soviet intelligence developed extensive and well-informed intelligence networks on Chinese soil. However, on the eve of the Chinese Communists' victory over the nationalist Kuomintang, now the Taiwan, Stalin decided to hand over Soviet intelligence networks to Chinese comrades. So this clandestine agent networks was handed over to the fraternal Chinese comrades as a gesture of goodwill. Names of these individuals working for the Soviet Union in China were disclosed to the Chinese Communist Party, and some were recruited, some were executed. But this Stalin's gesture of goodwill toward China has severe consequences. At the outset of this Sino-Soviet border conflict in 1969, Soviet intelligence had hardly any clandestine intelligence networks in China. Soviet Union dried up intelligence and counterintelligence capabilities against what it had thought to be its fraternal state. I think intelligence sharing between Russia and China, although now it is reported that China shared satellite information with Russia, I admit China and Russia sharing the adversary and Chinese-Russian intelligence counterintelligence, they are very similar to each other in terms of no democratic control, the autocratic methods, but both countries try to maintain strategic autonomy backed by their own geopolitical calculus and historical lessons, I think, undercurrent that makes Chinese and Russian intelligence agencies strive for independence from each other because intelligence and counterintelligence agencies are the last bastion of the sovereignty. So this is something that limits potential for possible cooperation in intelligence agencies within two countries. But they can temporarily mute intelligence, counterintelligence capabilities because of this now political rapprochement, political agreement between Putin and Xi Jinping. Counterintelligence of both countries temporarily mute their capability against each other, but they will not abandon them. I think Russia has to maintain this Chinese line, while Chinese has to maintain the Russian line. But don't get me wrong, because I'm not suggesting that we lower our guards. Each of them alone, Chinese services, Russian services, is a huge, significant challenge for Western intelligence communities. But what I mean is this synergy effect from cooperation between these two countries is perhaps smaller than that from the cooperation between, for example, US, Japan, or Five Eyes.
So we turn to cybersecurity threats and a question for Ken. One of the counterintelligence capabilities where Japan is particularly lagging is in the area of cybersecurity. And improving this capability is particularly important for Japan's national security, given that cybersecurity threats in Japan have increased, I think, by a factor of 35 in the last 10 years by some measures. Japan has stated in its revised 2022 national security strategy that it wants to strengthen its cybersecurity capabilities and is making efforts in this direction. Quite a lot more to do in the world of cybersecurity defense. Japan's moving to active cyber defense in the new national security strategy, of course. Why is Japan lagging behind in cyber defense capabilities?
I think there are three reasons. Firstly, in Japan, it is generally recognized that the cybersecurity is neither intelligence nor defense matter, but purely technical matter. Therefore, Japan's cybersecurity is entrusted with IT engineers who do not know intelligence, defense, and policy making. On the other hand, Japanese policymakers are not interested in technical matters at all. As a result, nobody can consider the cybersecurity policy from both political and technical point of view. The situation is very close to the code breaking in the World War II. The ability of Japanese Army and Navy's code breaking teams were not bad, but the military leaders who didn't recognize the importance of code breaking had not spent much money and staff to the teams. And as a result, Japan was beaten by the Allies in the code breaking war. Secondly, the Japanese constitution strictly prohibits military aggression, and the dogma is applied to the cyberspace as well. That means the Constitution also prohibits the act of cyber offensive operations and even active cyber defense. I think active cyber defense is critically important for cybersecurity. Now, discussion on the topic has just started recently in Japan. Lastly, there is not many cyber educational institutions in Japan. The MOD manages cyber school, but the student capacity is just 100 per year. The MOD is now planning to increase the number of cyber staff from 900 to 4,000 in 5 years. But the cyber school educates only 100 students in each year. It will probably take 30 years. Therefore, the MOD sends out their officers to private cyber schools in Japan and the United States, and also pulled out cyber specialists from private companies.
Dick, you wanted to come in.
This is a really important new development that Ken is identifying. There were a couple of reports. One was from Reuters recently that reported that MHI servers, this is MHI, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, which is Japan's largest defense contractor, that its services were hacked. And it was a very critical article about Japan's weak cyber defenses, and particularly singled out its very small pool of trained personnel who are willing to work in government on cyber issues. And that's despite recent significant salary raises and even the elimination of what had been physical fitness requirements to be a cyber officer, which is sort of odd given the correct characterization we had of cybersecurity as being the realm of, coming from MIT, I can say this, being the realm of nerds. The report also pointed out that offensive cyber has yet to be authorized by law. And Ken mentioned this, that's changing, and that's really important. This was as of yesterday or the day before, I forget, but the digital reform minister, Kono Taro, has just set up a study group. He's ordered it to provide a set of recommendations for delivery later this summer on how Japan can upgrade its active cyber defense, as sort of laid out in the National Security Statement in December 2022. But the Asahi reported that these recommendations are going to be massaged, as I said before, into the new legislation. It'll focus on three priorities: enhancing information sharing between public and private regarding best practices. That's important. Detection of cyber attacks, sharing information about that, and conferring authority to the government to preemptively strike computer servers if an imminent attack is detected. So this is a serious initiative that deserves careful attention being paid.
Sanshiro, you wanted to add something.
Since I'm living in Estonia, Estonia was the first country and the victim of large-scale cyber attacks back in 2007. At that time, government websites and the critical infrastructure, banks are targeted, attacked. The attack threatened national security by destabilizing public services for 22 days. So since then, Estonia has been putting a lot of efforts to strengthen cyber defense. Professor Kotani said cyber defense was not recognized as part of the work of the intelligence work. But when it comes to Estonia, annual reports of the internal security service and foreign intelligence service, there's a separate chapter on cybersecurity. Russia's full-scale invasion which started on February 24, 2022, by the way, which was the Independence Day of Estonia. The number of these waves of attacks, DDoS, denial of service attacks, had a record number of cyber attacks on Estonian websites. Estonian authorities noticed uninvited guests visiting Estonian websites to find security vulnerabilities, outdated software, or incorrect configurations. It is very difficult to attribute cyber attacks to particular organization or state, but all these attacks are actually coincided with, for example, when Estonia decided to remove Soviet monument in Narva, number of cyber attacks increased. Also, when Estonia suspended Russian TV channels, again, pro-Kremlin activists increased their activities. Cyber attacks is actually really proud of Russia's intelligence agencies. When it comes to Japan, I just want to mention that last year, in May 2023, Japan officially joined the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, which was hosted in Estonia, as a contributing nation, along with Ireland, Iceland, and Ukraine. Since 2021, Japan's self-defense forces and government agencies and communications critical infrastructure operators like NTT and power companies, they have been taking part in the cyber defense exercise called Locked Shields. Last year, during the exercise, more than 8,000 large-scale cyber attacks were simulated against 5,500 virtual systems, and a lot of lessons were learned. There is an international cooperation to strengthen awareness and cyber capability of Japan, also increase awareness of not only government officials, but also the public sectors, so these critical infrastructure operators.
Let's look at the outlook now for Japanese intelligence. And Dick, you mentioned the Five Eyes, and you also mentioned Konotaro, who I think has been an advocate for Japan joining the Five Eyes. Give us your views, if you will, on the prospects for Japan joining the Five Eyes.
I think Five Eyes entrance for Japan is possible. I'll get to the reasons why I think Japan's been its own worst enemy in gaining access in a moment. But I think I want to start by thinking about why Five Eyes would open up to new membership. And that has to do with the central reasons why there is intelligence reform at all. It seems to me that there are three factors that drive intelligence reform. First, it's not a secret sauce. So it's quite obvious. But when you put them together, you want to check these boxes to see what the probability is for Japanese entrance. The first is changes in the regional and global security environment. In any case, there's a generic driver of intelligence reform. And in Northeast Asia, the headlines are well known to all of us and to all of your listeners. Changes, it's a provocative China, a revanchist Russia, which is now allied with a reckless North Korea. And this is something that's only said sotto voce, and it's not said in decorous company usually, but a United States that's seen by some important people in Japan as in relative decline. So these are changes in a security environment that you check that box. That would contribute to the probability. Second is technology. The development of new technologies would likely require larger investments than the five alone could bring to the table. Now, assuming that money alone wouldn't buy a new partner's place at the Five Eyes table, this raises the question of whether Japan has technologies or other assets to bring to the party. And I think Japan is on its way to trying to demonstrate that it does. So recent reports suggest Japan's leaning into a formal linkage to AUKUS, for example, a step toward Five Eyes. It's a minilateral by contributing to joint defense productions with the US, with the UK, with Australia, by dispatching intel personnel to Australia. This week, we learned that it has signed an intelligence sharing agreement, including classified information, with New Zealand, a member of Five Eyes. So it seems that there's this Five Eyes campaign underway, which I think undergirded and propelled Robert's question, which is great. So I just wanted to clear my throat on that. But more than anything else, I think a lot of people have suggested for a long time, as I said earlier, that Japan has only itself to blame for not being invited into the Five Eyes. That is, its intelligence system was demonstrably porous during the Cold War and beyond, and many saw it as just too great a security risk. So Tokyo has been working very hard to seal up the leaks and should be given credit for that. Last month, and we've already discussed this, the Economic Security Clearance System was folded into the 2013 Special State Secrets Law. And this, I think, is a strong signal to the Five Eyes gatekeepers that Japan is serious about this. A final word, I guess, on Five Eyes. So long as it's as open ambitions for a full spectrum independent intelligence community were taboo in Japan, Five Eyes was not much discussed. And even after the taboo ended a decade or so ago, Japanese ambitions for Five Eyes membership was still not openly debated. I had my own experience in doing the work for special duty. I interviewed retired Japanese intelligence officials and recalled raising Five Eyes with them. One of them denied even knowing what Five Eyes was. I thought that was slightly disingenuous, but understandable. And another simply said, no comment, which was, of course, a standard. That's changed. Membership in Five Eyes now, as you said, Robert, it's been openly advocated by ministers of defense. Kono was a minister of defense, and he had advocated it before and since he was minister of defense, and by other senior LDP leaders. So the ball, I think, is now on the U.S. side, and there's pressure on Japan to create more effective ways to prevent leaks of security documents, and then we'd be able to check off all three of those boxes that I mentioned before.
So, Dick, you sound cautiously optimistic on Japan in Five Eyes at some point.
Cautiously optimistic. I've spoken to retired American intelligence officials who say, no way. They say Japan just can't be relied upon it's just too porous and so forth. But I think that view is going to change as Japan understands clearly now what's at stake if it can get in and what's at stake if it doesn't.
Ken, you had your hand up.
As Dick said, salary amount is very important. Usually the best Japanese engineers go to United States. The Japanese government is now ready to pay £100,000 annually to the efficient engineers. But they cannot stop the outflow of engineers to the United States. I think £100,000 per year, not bad, no? The Japanese government face the difficulties, the outflow of engineers for the moment. And as far as Five Eyes membership is concerned, no Japanese can know what they're doing in a circle. And we would like to have a chance to see what they are doing, actually, what Five Eyes is doing, being given a kind of lecture from them for discussing the matter.
Final question around the connection of Japan's intelligence capabilities to the broader shifts in its security posture, the defense reforms, and so on. What do you think the implications are of Japan's overall deterrence capabilities within the context of the broader reforms that perhaps are set out in the 2022 National Security Strategy? Dick, did you want to go first on that?
I think a lot more can be done. That's not going to surprise anyone who's familiar with the Japanese intelligence community. On the other hand, for the past decade at least, Japanese intelligence reform has had a new spring in its step. And I think it still does. Work on collection, on analysis, on coordination among intelligence units has been, as Ken said earlier, it's been enhanced by the National Security Secretariat and more broadly within the IC. What was really striking was that, and you mentioned this, Robert, the December 2022 National Security Strategy, also NSS, because it gets confusing here, mentioned intelligence reform 22 times. It was one of the report's 5 main elements of comprehensive national power. It's clear that Japanese planners are well aware that intelligence is a critical tool if they're to deter and or operate successfully in a contingency. So it now resides formally on a comprehensive palette. It exists on a new comprehensive palette of national security instruments that includes the economy, the technology base, and material strength. Speaking of comprehensive, I'm going to say one more word about the nesting of intelligence under the umbrella of comprehensive national power. I was really struck by that. And some of your listeners who are familiar with Japan are going to remember how pragmatic Japanese strategists back in the 1980s and 90s invented a term called comprehensive national security, sort of back to the Ohira Masayoshi days. And that was used to justify low defense spending and to emphasize Japan's commitments to diplomacy and to foreign economic policy and to divert attention away from anything having to do with things that go bang in the night. It was very interesting to see how the NSS, the National Security Strategy, speaks instead to comprehensive national power and foregrounds the military and the intelligence community in the national security toolkit. I think that's an important reinvention of the concept of comprehensiveness, to be honest. I don't know who else has paid any attention to this, but it's striking. Maybe it's because of my age. It's had traction. The report says that intelligence should be shared and utilized both within and outside the government. Within and outside, that sort of jumped out at me because national security strategy declared that the government and the private sector would work together to prevent leakage of critical intelligence regarding national security. So it's all hands on deck, recognizing and focusing on the same problem that's been haunting that community for some time. So it also called for, among these 22 comments, called for broadened collection, for closer cooperation between policy and intelligence communities and so forth. Enhanced cooperation, for example, between CIRO's Cabinet Satellite Intelligence Office and the Ministry of Defense, as well as the self-defense forces. Now, we've heard some of this, actually a lot of this before, and one should always retain some skepticism about promises and ambitions like this. But here, collaboration seems more explicit than ever. And it's a matter of open national policy for the first time. You've got new institutions, you've got new laws designed to address seriously what's been the greatest weakness of Japan's intelligence, which is the stovepiping and the leakage. It's endemic to all intelligence communities, but particularly noticeable in Japan, and a particular obstacle to joining in collaboration with other countries. So I was struck by the explicitness of the national security strategy across all domains, human, open source, signals, images, the whole range. So perhaps spring in its step is an understatement, the determination of the Japanese government to adjust its approach to intelligence, but it's certainly expanded its idea of what national security requires.
Ken, Japan's intelligence capabilities and its overall deterrence credibility.
As Robert mentioned before, intelligence contributes to the formulation of policy decisions of the national security. But I suspect that Japan's immature intelligence capabilities will be able to respond to security difficulties caused by China, North Korea, and Russia in the future. In the Cold War period, Japan's national security policy just followed the American directions. But now Japan should consider her national security by herself. Without a proper intelligence system, the Japanese government cannot decide anything in the field of national security. The problem is that the inability of Japanese intelligence is well known to not only allied nations, but also to Russia, China, and North Korea. They regard Japan as a spy heaven. That means the foreign spy can do everything in Japan. I think it's important for Japan to set up overseas intelligence service and anti-spy law, but it takes much time and political resources to reconstruct a whole intelligence community. It is also important that the government should cope with immediate issues such as cybersecurity, counter-disinformation, and economic security, etc., etc.
Sanshiro, I saw you nodding when Ken said Japan is spy heaven. Do you want to have the final word on Japan's intelligence capabilities and its overall deterrence credibility?
I really agree with Professor Kotani. I'm not an expert in Japanese intelligence, but when I'm looking at the European situation, when Russia started this full-scale invasion, almost a million Russian citizens fled Russia, and they came to European countries. Not only Ukrainian refugees, of course, more Ukrainians fled Ukraine and came to Europe, but significant number of Russians are now fled, and they are now in Europe. I'm just applying this situation to Japan. Of course, I mean China. We hear, I think over the past couple of years, we hear several instances, Chinese professors teaching at Japanese universities. They disappeared when they returned to China to meet their parents, but they just disappeared. And then it turned out that actually they were arrested, charged with spying for Japan, etc. What we can do with these Chinese or foreigners who are coming to Japan, and I think the number of foreigners coming to Japan is now growing and will grow in the long term. My concern is we are now experiencing population decline. At some point in the future, Japan we have to relax some immigration policies. We get more and more foreigners. But at the same time, of course, we welcome immigrants. No, we have to integrate them into our society. But still, same time, all these counterintelligence measures should be taken by the time Japanese immigration policies will change. That is my biggest concern. We need to have in mind the situation in the 20, 30 years ahead.
Thank you. That brings us to our final questions, the Japan Memo questions, which we ask all our wonderful guests at the end of each podcast. One is if you have a book recommendation or books recommendation for listeners that want to understand Japan better, and you are, of course, allowed to recommend your own volumes. And the second question is what you think people often get wrong about Japan. Let's start with Dick.
Okay, thank you. I hadn't thought it seemly to tout my own books on Japan. I thought I would instead badmouth my discipline entirely, because I think the best books written about Japan, the ones that I've learned the most from, have not been by political scientists at all. I'm a card-carrying political scientist. Historians have done a better job than political scientists helping us understand Japan. Especially for this podcast audience, I have to mention that one of my favorite books ever on Japan was written by Tessa Morris Suzuki. It's a superb study entitled Exodus to North Korea, Shadows from Japan's Cold War. It's not going to satisfy a lot of people, and it doesn't make Japan always look good, but it's, I think, good, honest, and very touching accounts of how efforts by the Japanese government in the early 1960s, in collaboration with the International Red Cross in Geneva and North Korea, efforts to work with them to reduce the number of former Korean subjects who were found themselves living in Japan, and then move them to the DPRK. And many of them, of course, that's moving them to jail and never to be seen or heard from again. It's an amazing story, and Tessa is a wonderful writer, and I recommend the book. I also thought that her history of Japanese economic thought is a keeper, and a very fine book on Japan. I'm not going to mention my own, but I'll mention those of my colleague, one of the books of my colleague, who's very well known, and that's John Dower. He's now retired, but his final book to date is Embracing Defeat. It won the Pulitzer Prize. It won the Los Angeles Book Award, New York Book Award. It won all the prizes, and it deserved to. It's a remarkable account of the very admirable resilience of the Japanese people as they totally embraced a total defeat in a total war. It's certainly well worth reading.
I don't want to lose this opportunity to plug the book of my colleague, Ken Kotani, who has written really what is the gold standard on Japanese intelligence. Japanese intelligence in World War II, it's a translation of what is the standard study of Japanese intelligence in Japanese. I commend it to one and all.
And what do you think that people get wrong about Japan?
Yeah, I think there are two things that have bugged me for a very long time about the way people think about Japan and get things wrong about Japan. The first is actually the way I opened Special Duty. Anyone who's ever taken a course with me knows I opened courses with it, and that's my obsession about the so-called Shimaguni-ron. It's first on my list. It's this story that the Japanese tell themselves and that they tell foreigners about Japan to explain almost anything that Japanese do. It's this notion that Japan is a unique small island trading nation precariously dependent upon imported raw materials adrift in a hostile or maybe anarchic world. And it's used, as I say, to explain a great many elements of Japanese social and political, institutional behavior, as well as foreign and security policy. And it's not 100% wrong, but I recall listening to the great international relations scholar Karl Deutsch back in the day, and he pointed out in one of his lectures that if there was ever a single explanation for an event or for behavior, it surely never would have happened. I rather got attached to that because in regard to this Shimaguni-ron, Japan is not small. It's the world's fourth largest economy. It's no more dependent upon trade than many other countries. It's less dependent than Germany. It's less dependent than France. It's less dependent than Brazil. It's not even one of the top 10 trade-dependent countries in the OECD, and it's less dependent on trade than that other island trading nation, the UK. And above all, Japan's uniqueness is no more unique than British uniqueness or American uniqueness or Chinese uniqueness or Russian uniqueness. They're all unique. And so I'd say beware of the small island trading nation explanation for all that happens in Japan and interrogate it. The second thing that bugs me is the extent to which Japan is treated as a monolith. Like all large and all wealthy countries, it's riven by political and bureaucratic competition. We've talked about that today in this conversation. And if our analyses miss that competition, and some do, they're likely going to fail to understand the actual dynamics that drive decision making and planning, not least of all, national security strategy.
Thank you, Dick. Sanshiro, books to recommend, and what do you think people get wrong about Japan?
I think I will start with this for a second question: what people get wrong about Japan. There is one book written by American urban sociologist Ray Oldenburg, and in his seminal book, The Great Good Places in 1989. This book stressed the importance of third places, so-called third places, so informal public gathering places where people can just spend time, relax. It happens between home and work. Home is first place, work is second place. So the third place is something between home and work, and you can relax, spend time. He, with his Orientalism or imagination of an Oriental country, Oldenburg named Japanese tea houses as one of such third places, along with Paris cafe, London pubs, or Florence pizzeria, Vienna's cafe houses. But in contemporary Japan, visiting tea houses remain the privilege and privileged professional entertainment for a handful of people. Instead, many Japanese went to some snack bars or izakaya, and it's a type of popular and inexpensive drinking place, often equipped with karaoke. And the book I would recommend, American author again, Michael Molasky. He's from St. Louis, but he's been living in Japan for long. He wrote a book which is called Nomeba Miyako, Izakaya no Tokyo. He wrote about Japanese drinking places, so drinking culture of Japanese, how Japanese after work go to this, izakaya, drinking pubs and bars with their colleagues, and how it is important to understand Japanese drinking culture, some details of the drinking establishments. He wrote this book in Japanese, and this book was not translated to English, but I really recommend because his observations, although he's not native Japanese, but still his observation is very, very insightful. Even other Japanese would not be able to this kind of observation.
So we've got tea houses and Japanese drinking culture. So a bit of a theme there for you, Sanshiro. Ken, books and what people get wrong about Japan.
I recommend to read Professor Samuel's book, Special Duties for Understanding Japanese Security Policy and Intelligence. Japanese intelligence system has been disturbed by administrative sectionalism and stovepipes before and after World War II. Professor Samuel's work shows us how difficult to share information among agencies and also difficult to integrate intelligence and policy making process in the Japanese government. I also recommend to read Japanese manga, comics, and watch various Japanese animations because most Japanese teenagers love to read and watch them. If you'd like to know their way of thinking and values, I think watching Japanese animations would be the quickest way. From my personal experience of my college life, I feel that the animation knowledge is an important tool to communicate with students. And last week, I visited Foyles, one of the largest bookstore in London, and I noticed there was a Japanese manga comic section, which was far larger than intelligence book section, unfortunately. I visited the store for more than a quarter century, but I think the section is the first ever. I realized the manga comics culture is also becoming popular among British people.
And what do people get wrong about Japan, in your view?
Japan has been imagined as a high tech society, but the reality is lagging behind the digitalization compared with European and American societies. Even in Asia, Chinese and Korean societies are a long way ahead of Japan in digitalization. For example, there are still many restaurants and cafes in Tokyo accept cash payment only, and we need to have cash whenever we go. In general, elderly Japanese people face difficulties in using digital devices, and I think such analog lovers attitude does also cause the backwardness of Japanese cybersecurity.
Thank you, Ken. And thank you very much to Dick, Ken, and Sanshiro for your fantastic insights on this important subject. Please do follow them all on X. The details of their handles will be on the show notes. And thank you to our listeners as well for joining us on another episode of Japan Memo. If you have any comments or feedback, please contact us on this email, japanchair@iiss.org, with your feedback. If you enjoyed this episode, we urge you to subscribe to Japan Memo on the podcast platform of your choice. And for more insightful analysis, I also encourage you to look at past research from the Japan Chair Programme and by the IISS more broadly on our website. Thanks again, and see you next time. Goodbye.